this part, let's discuss rule 3.09 till 3.12. 3.09 is extend or pay. A beneficiary's request to extend the expiry date of the standby or alternatively to pay the amount available under it is a presentation demanding payment under the standby to be examined as such in accordance with these rules. Remember, this rule applies when the beneficiary requesting for an amendment of the standby, that is extension of expiry, while submitting the documents for examination. So here in the presentation, there might be a request for an amendment and other required documents as well. The issuer can consider such presentation as a request for amendment or just a presentation. As the request is from the beneficiary side, by making such request, the beneficiary accepts the following by default. What are they? Implies that the beneficiary consents to the amendment to extend the expiry date to the date requested. This is quite logical. The beneficiary is asking the issuer to extend the expiry date of the standby to any date, then it consents to the same in default, right? Next one is requests the issuer to exercise its discretion to seek the approval of the applicant and to issue that amendment. Let's consider the issuer accepts this presentation as a request for amendment. Then, in its sole discretion, it may seek the approval of the applicant for such amendment. But if the issuer decides not to amend the standby even after the approval from the applicant, it can simply honor or dishonor such presentation timely. Next one is upon issuance of that amendment, retracts its demand for payment and consents to the maximum time available under these rules for examination and notice of dishonor. So by making such a request, the beneficiary also consents to retract its demand and permits the issuer to make use of the maximum time available for it to examine the presentation, right? Next one is no notice of receipt of presentation. An issuer is not required to notify the applicant of receipt of a presentation under the standby, which means issuer is not obligated to inform the applicant before making the payment under the standby. Because in some cases what will happen is the applicant may approach the court of law to stop payment under the standby. Such remedial measures may be suitable when the drawing under the standby is of abusive nature, but it will be a risk to the beneficiary in case of a genuine drawing. So as per ISP, it's not an obligation for the issuer to inform the applicant before making the payment, right? Next one is issuer waiver and applicant consent to waiver of presentation rules. In addition to other discretionary provisions in a standby or these rules, an issuer may, in its sole discretion, without notice to or consent of the applicant and without effect on the applicant's obligation to the issuer, waive. Remember, this rule applies when the issuer inserts some terms in the standby for the operational convenience or to ensure orderly processing and payment, and this applies only when such terms are for operational convenience, right? Not for a documentary condition. Because what happens is in some cases the beneficiary may not be able to comply with such operational conditions because the issuer can insert any condition for making its work easy. At that time, the issuer is empowered to waive such requirements if it decides to do so, and such decision is completely based on the issuer's discretion, and most importantly, such decision should not affect its right to get reimbursement from the applicant. And remember, issuer can waive all these requirements without the approval of the applicant. It is entirely based on issuer's discretion, right? What are the rules? The following rules and any similar terms stated in the standby which are primarily for the issuer's benefit or operational convenience, which means issuer is not only allowed to waive any requirement as listed from 1 to 4 here, it can also waive any other similar requirement in the standby if such condition is primarily for operational convenience or the issuer's benefit, right? This list is just an indicative list, right? First one is treatment of documents received at the request of the presenter as having been presented as a later date, rule 3.02. What is rule 3.02? This rule defines what is presentation. As per this, even if all the documents are not presented, it is considered as a presentation. In general case, if the beneficiary submits only 2 out of 3 required documents, the issuer will raise a discrepancy stating that all the required documents are not presented. But if the issuer decides to allow the presenter to submit the missing documents on a later date on the same presentation without raising a discrepancy, it can do so as per this rule, right? It's allowed, and it can make such a decision without the approval of the applicant, right? Next one is identification of a presentation to the standby under which it is presented. Rule 3.03a. What is rule 3.03a? A presentation must identify the standby under which the presentation is made. But if the beneficiary not complied with this condition, that is if the beneficiary not mentioned the standby reference number on the face of the document, neither attached the copy of standby, still the issuer may waive such a requirement if decides to do so without any approval from the applicant. Right? Next one is where and to whom presentation is made except the country of presentation stated in the standby. Here the rules referred are Rule 3.04 B, C and D. What these rules discuss? These rules defines what the presenter has to do if the place of presentation or location at the place of presentation is not defined in the standby. But even if the beneficiary not followed all these conditions, then the issuer can waive such requirements, right? But remember, anyway, the beneficiary is not allowed to present the documents to UK instead of USA, right? That's what this means, except the country of presentation stated in the standby. The issuer can waive all these requirements except the country of presentation as stated in the standby, right? Or treatment of a presentation made after the close of business hours as if it were made on the next business day. That is Rule 3.05B. As per Rule 3.05B, if the presentation is made after the business hours, then it will be considered as made on the next following business day. But if the issuer want to accept the documents after the business hours, it can accept. But it is not a right to the presenter to submit the documents after the business hour, right? Anyway, decision maker is the issuer. So till now, the issuer can waive any similar conditions as stated above. But for the next part, the issuer is only allowed to waive these following requirements. That is why here it is mentioned the following rule, but not similar terms stated in the standby, right? The issuer can waive a requirement only if the following terms are used in the standby. It cannot waive any similar requirements. What are they? A required document dated after the date of its stated presentation. Rule 4.06, which means as per Rule 4.06, the document presented must not be later than the date of presentation. But if the issuer wants, it can waive such requirement, right? Next one is the requirement that a document issued by the beneficiary be in the language of the standby. Rule 4.04. As per Rule 4.04, the language of documents presented has to be the same as that of standby, but the issuer can waive such requirement if it wishes to do so. If the issuer is satisfied with the document submitted in a different language, it can waive such requirement. But if it is not satisfied, it can raise a discrepancy. So the presenter is at the mercy of the issuer at this point of time, right? Next one is the following rule relating to the operational integrity of the standby only in so far as the bank is in fact dealing with the true beneficiary. Acceptance of a demand in an electronic medium. Rule 3.06b. What is mentioned in Rule 3.06b? Simply a demand should be presented in an electronic medium. Why? The concern is authenticated demand, but the issuer can waive such requirement if it is confident about the beneficiary. That is why here it is mentioned like this. In fact, the bank is dealing with the true beneficiary. So the issuer can waive such requirement and accept a demand in paper medium if it is confident that it is dealing with the true beneficiary, right? But waiver by the confirmer requires the consent of the issuer with respect to paragraph B and C of this rule. Because seen in Rule 1.11c, issuer includes a confirmer. So these provisions, as we saw earlier in 3.11, also applicable to the confirmer. But if the confirmer want to waive any requirements, then the consent of the issuer is required. Without that, the confirmer cannot waive the requirements as listed in Rule 3.11 B and C, right? Next one is original standby lost, stolen, mutilated or destroyed. First of all, what is the significance of the original standby? Even though it is not a negotiable instrument, its significance lies in the identification of the beneficiary, because only a beneficiary will be having an original standby. If it is stolen or lost, then it may be used for a fraudulent purpose as well. So this rule discusses the standby procedure when original standby is lost or stolen. Right? If an original standby is lost, stolen, mutilated or destroyed, the issuer need not replace it or otherwise waive any requirement that the original be presented under the standby. Simply, the issuer is not obligated to replace the standby if it is lost. It's the problem of beneficiary. Issuer is not concerned, right? It need not waive a requirement for the submission of original standby along with the presentation as well, because it's beneficiary's fault. The issuer cannot take any responsibilities for that. But if the issuer agrees to replace an original standby or to waive a requirement for its presentation, it may provide a replacement or copy to the beneficiary without affecting the applicant's obligation to the issuer to reimburse. But if it does so, the issuer must mark the replacement or copy as such. Which means, let's say the issuer agreed to issue a copy. Which means what? If the issuer replaced or provided a copy of the standby, then it should evidence the same on the face of the standby issued as a copy or duplicate to notify anyone who is going to rely on it for any reason, right? Also, it should record the same in its internal systems to safeguard itself from any fraudulent drawing by the original standby holder. And as a legal remedy against any fraudulent drawings, the issuer may, in its sole discretion, require indemnities satisfactory to it from the beneficiary and assurances from the nominated person that no payment has been made. Generally, before replacing the original or issuing a copy of the standby, the issuer will execute an indemnity with the beneficiary and it will ask for assurance from the nominated person or the confirming persons that no payment is made before. This is again a discretionary provision. If the issuer feels it is not required and it is confident of its action, then it can refrain from executing an indemnity. But in general, all issuers will do. All banks, all companies will do this without fail, right? So by this, let's end part 3. In the next part, we will cover rule 3.13 and 3.14.